Coming in at number 10, Superman vs. the Puzzler. There's no doubt that Superman has faced his fair share of hard-fought battles. You know, villains who actually make him work up a sweat at least, and ones that force him to use some of his more stronger powers. However, when the matchup is so unfair, Superman barely has to even try, and on top of that, he did use some of his lamer powers to defeat the Puzzler. The Puzzler that Superman faced here was the female version named Valerie Van Hopten. For years, she had admired Superman, even wanting to become a hero just like him. However, when she was unable to realize this dream, she turned to a life of crime and was eventually hired to kill the man that she once adored. Valerie has this unique ability to break her body down into puzzle pieces, but remember though, unique doesn't always mean powerful. Sure enough, when these two squared off, Superman just straight up tore her to shreds. I mean, that is her power, but if you're going to break into a billion little pieces, you better make sure that your opponent can't punch people into space. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this point, Superman doesn't even really have to try here. He relies on his lamest power, which is Super Breath. I mean, come on. If you have a lamer power that Superman has, leave me a comment down below. But just like that, the Puzzler is rendered useless from this breath. A cold breath. And then perhaps what's even more humiliating is that on her second time around, she ended up in a trash can. Yeah, very unfair. Coming in at number 9, Captain Boomerang vs. the Flash. This is another one of those fights where you see the villains psyching themselves up for a few pages, but you know that they have absolutely no chance. The Flash, in my opinion, gets overlooked far too often, probably because he isn't exactly a physically intimidating hero, and most of the time the heroes that can punch the hardest usually dominate the fight. But the Flash has superhuman speed, so he could technically kill his enemy before they even have a chance to introduce themselves. That's the delicate balance with the writing in a Flash comic book, and why it's a little bit different from the other ones. They have to walk this fine line between enemies that have the brain of a goldfish and a hero that seems to never remember his strongest power when a fight comes his way. But even so, this fight between Captain Boomerang and the Flash is so ridiculously one-sided. The Flash can outrun bullets, but old Boomerang here, who looks more like a lunch lady, actually thought that he could beat the Flash with a slower projectile that was designed to be returned to him. Then if that wasn't dumb enough, he straps explosives to said boomerangs. Seems like a flawless plan. Would somebody get this guy a Boomerang for Dummies handbook though, because he's gonna blow himself up. Coming in at number 8, Batman vs. Calendar Man. I'm sure that just by hearing the title at this point, you already know how this one's going to go. I'm sorry, but a guy who commits crimes related to the date is just one of the weirdest supervillains and not very smart considering the fact that Batman is a master detective. What's worse about this villain is that he's literally wearing a costume designed to correlate with the date of the crime that he committed, making it even easier to spot him. Due to this, he has become notoriously known as a joke to both heroes and other villains even. This matchup is so unfair that Batman would probably be better off just letting the Gotham Police Department arrest him on their own. Calendar Man is a successful inventor that is capable of designing machinery required for his various schemes, but put that against billionaire Bruce Wayne and there is no question that Batman is going to come out on top every single time.
Number 7, Black Canary vs. Superman. Pretty much any Injustice fight against Superman is brutal because of how powerful Superman is known for being, and of course how crazed and evil he is here. Black Canary attempts to take down the big bad Superman in Injustice, and at least she came armed with a gun and a kryptonite bullet to do so. Still, this fight ends how you'd expect it to, with Black Canary being no match for the Man of Steel. Well, almost anyways. She successfully shoots him, taking him out momentarily, but he is then chosen as a Yellow Lantern because of his immense ability to instill fear in others, which honestly I agree. Although she may be taken out by Superman's heat vision right after that with a shot straight to the gut, she does still end up getting a different kind of victory through her defeat. A consolation prize at least. She's wearing contacts that have the ability to record everything she sees, allowing people to see just how much of a brutal tyrant Superman has become, because they broadcast it everywhere. Also, I feel like if you actually put in contacts that had cameras in them, even in the future, even if like the technology was amazing, they still have to be pretty thick. Like, I have a hard enough trouble putting regular contacts in my eyes on days when I have to do that. Number 6, Hawkgirl vs. Barbastos. Granted, this was Nth Metal Enhanced Hawkgirl, but still, if you had told me this was how Dark Knight's metal was going to go down, I wouldn't have believed you. In the end, Hawkgirl was the one to defeat Barbastos in the comic. Though of course, that wouldn't be completely where that story would end, as we saw with the continuation in Dark Knight's Death Metal. However brief the fight between Hawkgirl and the Bat God was, it was still pretty cool that she was the one who ended up taking him down. Even if it was only because of, well, the Element X blade that she was really able to do this. Barbados is basically a god, so on paper this fight in general just sounds pretty crazy. Number 5, the Punisher versus Wolverine, and Spider-Man, and Daredevil. Now you might expect you know how this one should go, but let's also remember that this is Garth Ennis writing Punisher, so yeah. It doesn't really go down the way you'd think. Instead, the Punisher manipulates the 3 heroes briefly into turning against one another when they seek to bring him in. These 3 are hoping to team up to essentially arrest Punisher and then turn him over to the courts and, you know, get him convicted with like the law and all of that stuff, even though Wolverine needs a bit of convincing when it comes to this approach at the beginning. Punisher takes out all 3 of these heroes, even managing to disable Spider-Man by convincing him that if he moves, bombs will go off. You'd think Spider-Man would actually be able to sense whether or not this was true, but I digress. I guess his spidey sense wasn't working that well that day. Number 4, Superman versus Batman. I mean, you'd think you know how this one should shake out, considering Batman is just a normal human with a bunch of money and, well, years of training. However, in Dark Knight Returns, we get to be pleasantly surprised. A normal man, even when as skilled as Bruce Wayne, you'd think would just be no match for Superman, especially as, well, he's getting on in years here, whereas Kal-El, while also being older, barely looks or seems to have aged at all. But Batman uses all of his strategic skills, knowledge, and his gadgets to help him win this fight. And man, does it go to show that you should never dismiss Batman just because he doesn't have conventional superpowers. Or superpowers at all. Batman has the best superpower, the superpower to know a ton about heroes because he does his homework.
Coming in at number 3, STARFOX versus the Incredible Hulk. During the Incredible Hulk number 300, Bruce Banner is hulking out as per usual, except in doing so, he begins to completely demolish New York City. Now the Hulk is required to be doing this, and yet despite him laying down his big green punches, most of the Marvel squad seems pretty concerned. Now if any fellow hero was deserving of a beatdown for trying to stop the Hulk, it's STARFOX. And I have a feeling the rest of the Avengers would agree because he's notoriously one of the creepiest comic book characters of all time. STARFOX decides that the way he's going to soothe the Hulk is by using his special ability to emit waves of erotic pleasure. Now I don't claim to be a genius, but I'm fairly certain you can't take down the Hulk with waves of pleasure. Even if you could, how do you expect that to end gracefully? Thankfully, the Hulk was able to knock some sense into STARFOX and hit him with one of the hardest punches he's probably ever felt in his life. It was an extremely one-sided interaction that definitely made STARFOX rethink his approach. Coming in number 2, Dazzler versus Dr. Doom. This one is just sad. Not only does Dazzler lose this fight, but she does so in her own comic book. We're not sure what the writers were thinking when they made Dazzler because her powers are definitely not what one would expect to see from a superhero. Dazzler rocks a shiny outfit with a deep neckline and can convert sound into light, plus she wears roller skates. Well, she can skate really fast. I mean, it seems more like the resume of a DJ, but okay. Somehow the writers find a way to make sense of this hero attacking Dr. Doom, and her big plan is even more sad to watch play out. You see, Dazzler's dazzling plan to kill one of the most powerful supervillains of all time was to just skate at him really fast. That's like an astronaut saying, in order to reach the moon, I will now be climbing the world's largest ladder. Dazzler tries to hit him with her light show after this, but Dr. Doom just ultimately ends up electrocuting the entire room and capturing her until the Fantastic Four can arrive to save her. Coming in at number 1, Spider-Man versus the Sinister Six. Spider-Man is a kid with superpowers that has to experience puberty and bullying all at the same time, so there's no question that he's well versed when it comes to adversity, and supervillains are constantly adding to this pressure for him to remain on his toes at all times. However, even the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man can become overwhelmed from time to time. For example, when Dr. Octopus got the Sinister Six back together, they were fresh out of prison and had a lineup that featured the Hobgoblin and a new Sandman. Safe to say that if it weren't for Doc Ock's own ego and his Spidey's superpowered friends, his days could have easily been numbered by the Sinister Six.
At number 10, we have Cyclops versus Wolverine. In X-Men Schism number 4, a fight breaks out between these two superheroes because of a complex decision on how to face an onslaught of Sentinels unleashed by the world's powers. And as an enormous, seemingly regenerative Sentinel is approaching the two of them, Cyclops insists on allowing the young X-Men to stay and fight, while Wolverine believes it's wrong to put young ones in harm's way. So it's a battle between should we stay and fight or run and regroup. Well, Wolverine gets outranked by Cyclops, but instead of backing down, he goes to their home base and sets 2,000 pounds of explosives to go off at the press of a button to take out the Sentinel and allow for a distraction as they get away. Cyclops is angered by the subordination and decides to take it out on Wolverine as they start to battle it out. And the Sentinel is coming right towards them just to make everything worse. Maybe not the best time to pick an epic fight, guys, but it is a tough call and both arguments make sense to me in different ways. I guess this stuff just sometimes happens. Next on our list at number 9 is The Thing versus the Hulk. This is a classic showdown that many of you may already be aware of, where Ben Grimm and Bob Banner go at it in the middle of the city streets. Side note, Stan Lee accidentally referred to the Hulk's alter ego as Bob Banner instead of Bruce for a few months before correcting it. Just some trivia for you. Anyway, the reason why they're fighting is basically that the Hulk is going crazy and smashing everything in sight, trying to reach his goal of finding the Avengers to take them down. When the Hulk easily knocks out the Human Torch and holds on to him like a prize at the county fair, the Thing watches by the sidelines wanting to get involved. Then, after Invisible Woman tries to protect the Human Torch with an invisible force screen, she too is rendered unconscious by the Hulk. So the Thing has to take things into his own hands and fight the Hulk himself. The fight goes on for pages and pages, with buildings being knocked down, buses being torn in half. At one point, the Thing drives a boat. It's crazy. Unfortunately, it ends with the crazed Hulk getting the best of Benjamin Grimm, leaving him exhausted both physically and mentally, clambering back to his feet. Alright, at number 8, we've got Superman vs. SHAZAM. In 1996's Kingdom Come, we witness a fight between these two, initiating at the end of issue 3 and carrying out into issue 4. The reason behind the fight is complicated, but to keep it simple, SHAZAM has been brainwashed by Lex Luthor, so it's not really him controlling his own actions. But it is a tough thing watching as an aging Superman basically gets beaten up so badly that he almost dies. In this storyline, Superman has the pure intentions of trying to corral a new generation of less than heroic superheroes to help bring peace back to Earth. And with internal resistance on that front, and also these plots by his typical enemies to imprison him, he's really just not ready to defend himself. Not to mention, he's totally caught off guard, and once again, he's older. Luckily, after some serious blows of magical electricity coming from SHAZAM, Superman is finally able to get through to his alter ego and speak directly to Billy Batson, saving himself, and ultimately a whole lot more from what could have been a game-changing move for Lex Luthor and the others. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of destruction done when SHAZAM sacrifices himself to detonate an enormous bomb early in the air above the battlefield, saving countless lives.
Coming in at number 7, Thunder Punch versus the Transformers. Now, remember when I said that most superheroes are just people that punch really, really hard? Well, sometimes that isn't enough to cut it. And in the case of Thunder Punch, we feel even worse because his punches would probably be better suited for, I don't know, someone his own size. You see, Thunder Punch was one of the Neo Knights, this super team that was hell-bent on destroying the Transformers. Although, they didn't even try to design any new technology to do this. They just thought punching people really hard would be sufficient. I mean, it's worked out for other people, but not this case. Turns out when your opponent is a 4-story tall robot that can turn into a tank, punching him is just not gonna do the trick. The strangest part about Thunder Punch is the lack of logic when facing an enemy this big. The Transformers could step on him and not even notice. What's worse is the design of his costume, which completely exposes his hands. His body is coated in metal and hard fabric, but he chose to not cover up the one thing that he was hitting a robot with. Real smart. Coming in at number 6, Wolverine versus Magneto. Now this one here is deceiving because Wolverine has held his own against some really tough supervillains, but Magneto is, well, Magneto. During the 90s event called Fatal Attractions though, the X-Men were forced to attack Magneto's new asteroid base. Once there, an intense fight takes place where Professor X and Jean are telepathically attacking Magneto while Wolverine wounds him on the physical plane. This ultimately made Magneto really angry, and what followed was perhaps one of the most horrific comic book panels in X-Men history. Because Wolverine's skeleton is made of adamantium, Magneto could manipulate this just enough to rip the metal out of his body. This left Wolverine completely incapacitated and now with large spikes of metal sticking out of his body. His only savior was the fact that Professor X was able to wipe Magneto's memory before he could finish the job. In at number 5, Daredevil versus the Fantastic Four. Now we must give credit where credit is due. Daredevil certainly put up a valiant effort, but ultimately this was a 4-on-1 bout. The Fantastic Four are among the most powerful heroes in the Marvel Universe, and Daredevil is a blind lawyer. Well, he can also do karate, but he has to be extra crafty when it comes to planning his attacks. In the 1968 comic book The Flames of Battle, Daredevil decided to attack the Four Freedoms Plaza, and I gotta say, he was pretty successful. I mean, he somehow fooled the Human Torch into knocking over a water tower, and then he was able to get Mr. Fantastic to attack the Thing by accident. Originally, when Jack Kirby had drawn Daredevil just beating the crap out of the Thing, Stan Lee had to step in and say that it made absolutely no sense, which is why we saw Lee writing in a part of the story that sees Daredevil getting Reed Richards to accidentally hit the Thing with a nerve blast ray. Although the humor in how weak the Daredevil character is in comparison still resides in those thought bubbles. Right after the Thing is blasted, Daredevil stands back and thinks to himself, it wasn't my kick that stopped him. Probably not the best idea to be a superhero with low self-esteem, but there it is. Coming in number 4, Batman vs. Guy Gardner. Next up, we have the master billionaire detective again against the Green Lantern Guy Gardner. Gardner is wielding one of the most powerful weapons in the universe, but in 1987, this was somehow no match for Batman's money, punches, and cool technology. During the Justice League International number 5, Guy Gardner's lips were flapping as per usual, and so his big mouth got a big punch from Batman. In theory, Gardner should be more than capable of taking out Batman, but due to his extreme arrogance, he removed his power ring right before taking a swing at the Dark Knight. The removal of his ring automatically makes this an unfair fight for Guy Gardner, and in comparison to the big villains Batman has taken down, he makes quick work of Guy in this fight.
Alright, here we are at number 3 with Captain America vs. Iron Man, or just the Civil War storyline. I'm gonna match those two into one because they're basically the same conflict. But Iron Man and Captain America have had a deep bond for quite some time, but there are some times when they have disagreements that turn into physical altercations. One of these fights takes place in the Armor Wars storyline when Tony Stark learns that his own technology has been stolen to create super soldiers. And when Captain America sees a chance to preserve the armor, Iron Man gets a bit physical since he wants the technology to stay exclusively to him. So Iron Man knocks out Cap with an electrical charge and leaves the room. But this altercation doesn't even compare to the fight they have during the Civil War event, which we all know has Iron Man and Captain America pitted against each other in their own factions. When Captain America goes in for a handshake in Civil War issue 3, he leaves an electron scrambler on Tony's hand, which immobilizes his whole suit, leaving him on the ground while the rest of the team faces off. But Tony isn't done, gets up to land a massive blow on Steve, tearing his mask and nearly severing his jawbone. It's sad to see old friends fight like this, but it definitely makes for a pretty exciting read. At number 2, we've got Batman vs. Superman. This turn of events is so impactful on the storyline we're used to that it was turned into a movie. These two had a relationship so tight they were like brothers, who sometimes fought. But most of the time these fights would be due to mind control, like in the Hush storyline when Superman is brainwashed by Poison Ivy and sent to attack Batman. But we all know the fight that really puts these two near the top of our list is the one in Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. This storyline, set in the future, depicts an older, more brutal Batman who is wreaking havoc against crime in Gotham. And when the government notices Batman acting out of sorts, they send Superman after him to put a stop to it. And this fight is epic. What really makes it cool is that you'd expect a human Batman to be totally outmatched by the Kryptonian alien Superman, but the matchup is more even than you'd expect. And it ends with the two in what seems like almost a draw. But that's where I'll leave it for the few of you who don't know what happens still. Needless to say, it's a pretty insane face-off, but I think it's fair to say that the world is better off with these heroes on the same side. Okay, finally at number 1, there's Avengers vs. X-Men. This showdown has happened before this new event coming out soon, it just didn't involve the Eternals. And of course the context will most likely be different. But in the original Avengers vs. X-Men event, the disagreements start with the two factions having opposing views on how to approach dealing with Phoenix Force. On one hand, the X-Men think the Phoenix Force will bring a rebirth to mutant species, a cause they have always felt very passionate about. But the Avengers are concerned that Phoenix Force will basically wipe out all life on Earth. When 5 of the X-Men are possessed by the Force, the battle then becomes more complicated, with this third team now involved. And what's good about this is that the Phoenix 5 then become a common enemy between the remaining X-Men and the Avengers, who start trying to take them out one by one. Eventually, it's just Cyclops with the Phoenix Force in him, and he basically gets turned into full-blown Dark Phoenix, putting an end to the fighting between the Avengers and the X-Men. Because you don't really have time to fight each other when there's a Dark Phoenix with a laser vision flying around.
Number 10, Squirrel Girl versus Dr. Doom. When Squirrel Girl was new on the scene, she was still weirdly proving how OP of a character she was. Although any fight involving Squirrel Girl you would think would be super unfair in terms of her being completely outmatched. And you'd be right about these fights being unfair, but it's usually more often the other way around, with many of her opponents standing no chance against her. One of her first fights happened to go just like that, featuring the brilliant and dangerous Dr. Doom, who found himself quickly trounced by Squirrel Girl when she attacked him with squirrels, leaving him to be pretty much embarrassed about this fight forever onward. Number 9, Captain America versus the Punisher. This was a very one-sided fight, not only on paper, but also just in terms of how this all went down. Two villains, Goldbug and Plunderer, were willing to join Captain America's side of the fight in Civil War, revealing that even the supervillain community was concerned about what would happen if Iron Man won. They might be villains, but they were people too, and were terrified at the prospect of the nation becoming a police state. Punisher didn't like the idea of working with villains though, and shot down their offer by literally gunning them down. This resulted in a pissed off Cap beginning a brutal fight with Frank, who refused to fight back because, well, Captain America was one of the good guys? So based on how this fight shook out, I don't know if you'd actually be able to tell. Captain America beats the Punisher within an inch of his life over the course of a handful of panels, and also calls him a murderous piece of trash. Wow, that is pretty brutal, Cap. Alright friends, before we move on to this next point, just a quick reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you're enjoying it. It really does help us out here at the channel. Number 8, the Punisher versus Daken. In this fight, Punisher once again is brutally defeated by his opponent, though this time a lot more permanently. Punisher ends up being no match for Daken, who makes quick work of him despite all his guns. I mean, we already knew this was how it was going to end, didn't we? Considering Daken takes after his dad, Logan, and has a pretty intense healing factor. The real impressive thing though is just how much of a beating and stabbing Frank withstands before Daken inevitably takes the victory. In the end, Daken decapitates Frank Castle, killing him, though Frank of course would later come back as the monster Frankencastle and then later be returned to his old self once again.
Alright, at number 7 we've got Reed Richards versus Namor. This is a spicy face-off as it's a classic fight of jealousy and competition over a woman's affection. Susan Storm is unconscious in the hospital, and the arrogant and shameless Namor keeps making advances on her right in front of Richard. This escalates to the point where Namor actually makes a move on Susan as she's just barely coming to, and right when Reed enters the room as well. Susan tries to de-escalate the situation, but it's no use due to her injuries and fatigue, so the two heroes go after it. As they rip through the city streets, they throw insults at each other as they tear apart cafes, cars, and the road. It's a pretty fiery battle that Richard seems to know he's at risk of losing due to Namor's sheer strength, but Reed takes the win in the end, exclaiming in a heroic monologue that his anger isn't actually directed at Namor, but at himself for not being a good husband to Susan throughout the years. It's a pretty epic battle with some realistic and possibly relatable motivations, giving it a rightful spot on our list. Coming in at number 6 is Namor again versus Daredevil this time. In this instance, Namor is being arrested as if the human legal system is any match for a superhero, and to represent him, he decides to hire the blind Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil. Basically, Namor is angry because he wants a place on land for his people who have only ever lived under the sea. In fact, he actually wants to sue the entire human race for denying them their birthright, as he calls it. Matt, being the pragmatic lawyer that he is, simply acknowledges that there's just no legal precedent for suing the whole human race. This obvious and very astute point throws Namor the Submariner into a rage that he takes to the streets without using the door. And in this moment is actually when Daredevil first wears the red suit that we all know, and it's in preparation for his fight with Namor, where Daredevil is off to protect humanity from an outraged underwater superhero. So this fight between two superheroes is heated by an external issue that forces them to clash. In so many words, Daredevil's sense of duty is clashing against Namor's rage. They take the fight directly to the streets, busting down lampposts, crumbling brick walls, and even taking over a wrecking ball at one point. The fight ends with Namor winning, naturally, claiming that Daredevil had been the most courageous of all his foes, at least, despite having faced off against the Fantastic Four and the Avengers. And that's a pretty good accolade for Daredevil if I've got to say anything about it. At number 5, we've got Spider-Man vs. Wolverine. This face-off has such a crazy build-up that it actually needs its own issue called, you guessed it, Spider-Man vs. Wolverine. They fight because Spider-Man finds himself caught up in an ongoing operation that Wolverine had been a part of for a long time before the events of this story. And it's, like I said, it's a long story, but basically this woman named Charlemagne is in such a predicament involving Russian assassins and basically an internal manhunt for her arrest, so she actually asks Wolverine to end it for her, to save her from going to a gulag. Spider-Man notices Logan is about to actually make her wish come true. He swoops in, and this is the last straw for Logan. This fight takes place in a graveyard of all places, leaving the two superheroes in a stalemate, each of them seriously threatening to end each other's life. But luckily the fight is broken up at the exact moment by a chopper with its spotlight on, and as this distraction has both of them gripped, someone creeps up on Spidey, who senses it and delivers a brutal punch. But unfortunately it wasn't Wolverine. Instead it was the woman he'd been trying to save, and the punch kills her. I mean, don't be too hard on yourself, Spidey, it's what she wanted, right? And even Logan acknowledges that she probably planned it that way. Okay, at number 4, it's the battle between Thor and Beta Ray Bill. This battle is pretty epic considering it's the fight that would determine whether or not Beta Ray Bill is worthy of Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. He'd already shown his worth by actually being able to pick it up, but that wasn't enough, as Thor fights back against his new contender. The battle rages into a river of lava, leaving both warriors exhausted, lying on an obsidian raft. But they float steadily towards a lava fall, waterfall made of lava, you know what I mean. Beta Ray Bill shows his worth further by saving an unconscious Thor from the deadly plunge. After all is said and done, the two warriors end in a draw, approaching Odin with the results. And instead of taking away Thor's hammer and handing it over to Bill, Odin offers him a brand new weapon called Stormbreaker. So it turns out okay in the end. But this is a battle for the history books, with two of the most powerful superheroes in the whole Marvel Universe facing off for the glory of respect and worthiness.
Number 3, The Punisher vs. Sentry. During Dark Reign, Punisher refuses to stand by and let Norman Osborn become the world's new, biggest, and brightest hero, as S.H.I.E.L.D. is disbanded and Osborn becomes the head of its replacement organization, Hammer, and the new Dark Avengers team. Punisher aims to eliminate Norman Osborn, but standing in his way is the Sentry, who stops the Punisher's bullet mid-air as it soars towards Osborn's head. Sentry sets his sights on Frank, and, well, I think you can imagine how this one goes. Still, at least this fight is gratifying in the sense that it isn't over with like a 1-2 punch. Instead, we actually watch as the Punisher tries everything he can to try to defeat Sentry, knowing it's pretty much all hopeless, but refusing to give up. And he does all this while being brutalized by Robert, who initially just wants to talk it out and arrest Punisher without a fuss. So that's how Punisher is actually able to survive, because Sentry just wants to talk. Punisher's skills and weapons aren't what save him actually at the end of the day. He simply manages to get lucky when Robert doesn't call out his get out of jail attempt at bluffing. Thank goodness. Number 2, Superman vs. Alfred Pennyworth. You would think you already know how this fight would shake out, but hey, it didn't go down quite the way most of us would expect when it happened in Injustice. After Superman broke Batman's back with the good old Bane snap over the knee move, he had a brief moment of regret as Batman called him out for being more monster than hero, for torturing him, all while claiming it was for the greater good. As Superman considers what he's just done, he turns to Alfred, who has approached him. However, Alfred didn't approach Superman to, communicate any words of wisdom here, or to help Clark come back around and regain his senses and see the error of his ways. He came to teach Superman a lesson about attacking Bruce. Alfred used a pill which temporarily granted him the same level of strength as Superman, making this super uneven fight on paper a lot more even in reality. Using the element of surprise, Alfred was then able to beat Superman to a pulp while confessing that he was very disappointed at him, before scooping up Bruce and taking him to safety. Reminding everyone that even when it comes to facing powerful foes like Superman, Alfred is still and will always be a badass. in case people forgot. Number 1, Squirrel Girl versus Galactus. I freaking love this fight, and I love that I started this list with Squirrel Girl and I'm ending it with her, even though this fight is super ridiculous. You wouldn't think someone like Squirrel Girl, whose powers include communicating with and controlling squirrels and sharp teeth, would be able to take on and even defeat the epic force of Galactus, who is nigh unstoppable and comes armed with the Power Cosmic, which basically allows you to do, well, whatever writers need whoever wields it to do. Power Cosmic, by the way, turns out does help Galactus to communicate in the vacuum of space as well. In the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl issue 4, Squirrel Girl defeats Galactus by realizing that the only way to defeat him is by offering him an alternate planet to devour other than Earth. She and Tippy Toe manage to access the databases in his ship's computers and find one that is covered in nuts, which they manage to convince Galactus are delicious and nutritious, full of calories, life energy. Life energy. As strange as this all sounds, the whole issue is pretty great when it comes to writing, so as weird as it sounds that Squirrel Girl was able to beat Galactus, it actually really makes sense in this context.